Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Vocus webinar, Fix Your Broken Content Strategy. I'm Natalia Dickey, Director of Product Management at Vocus, a Cision company, and your moderator for today. During today's webinar with Arik Hanson, we're going to learn how to stop relying on long shots and adopt a more pragmatic approach to content. We'll get step-by-step instructions for developing a winning content strategy, from planning and creation to amplification and measurement, as well as how to use content cornerstones to create compelling social content and understand the pros and cons of things like outsourcing and insourcing. Before I go ahead and introduce Arik, we do have a few quick housekeeping points. First, questions. There will be a moderated Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so please feel free to use the Questions tab on your webinar panel to submit those anytime throughout the webinar today. If you want to download the slides, you can click the Download Slides PDF link. That's in the box titled Want to Learn More at the bottom of your audience console. If you are on Twitter today, and many of us are, and you want to tweet about this webinar, please use the Vocus Webinar hashtag. That's one word. Or you could also use the tweet box at the top of the webinar console. The top Vocus webinar tweets are going to receive a Vocus prize pack in the mail, and we'll be revealing those winners on Twitter shortly after the webinar. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. Arik Hanson is the Principal of Marketing and Communications Consultancy, ACH Communications. He's an award-winning communicator and marketer with nearly 20 years of experience in the industry. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies, including Walgreens and General Mills, as well as smaller local organizations. So with that, let's turn it over. Arik, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that warm introduction. I wish I could say the same for myself. I'm up here in snowy Minnesota, and it's about 35,000 degrees below zero. So if my voice starts to stutter throughout the presentation, you'll know it's because of the temperatures. Yeah, we're here today to talk about content strategy, and my take that kind of modern-day content strategy as we know it is kind of broken when it comes to branded content. And I show you a couple of examples here, not to pick on the likes of Zyrtec and Kohl's, but just to show you examples of the content that we've kind of all seen in our day-to-day lives online from brands, and how it kind of sometimes goes down the wrong road. And so we know marketers and PR folks as ourselves are facing this challenge. They're also facing the challenge that there's now more noise than ever before. I show you this slide to show you just one platform, Tumblr, as an example. It's gone from 17 million Tumblr blogs in May of 2011 to 195 million as of July of this year. So you can see the tremendous growth here in terms of the platform. And you would see similar type growth with some of the other platforms. So we know the noise ratio is going up by the day. As marketers and PR professionals, we're also facing this challenge as well. This is kind of some metrics from Simply Measured earlier this year, and unless you've been hiding under a rock, you've probably noticed that your organic reach on Facebook has dropped. So this is not only affecting these big brands like Disney and MTV and Mercedes, but virtually all of us, and what that's meant. So marketers and PR people, we know, the funny thing is we know this is a challenge, yet it seems like we're fully failing to prepare for it. So according to a study earlier this year from the Content Marketing Institute and Marketing Profs, only 38% of B2B marketers rated their content marketing as effective. 54% of those same B2B marketers saw producing engaging content as their biggest content marketing challenge. Yet only 35% of those marketers had a documented content strategy. So what's weird is, like, we know it's a challenge. It's our biggest challenge in many cases. We know our existing content isn't that effective, but yet we don't have anything written down that's guiding us. So, it might be time to fix that. So how did we get here, though? So we know the spot we're in isn't the best, maybe, but what happened? How did we get here? So, number one, you can blame me. I would not profess to be a social media guru by any stretch of the imagination. I kind of categorize myself, as Natalia said, as a communications consultant. That's really been my background. But I am a blogger, and I'm a consultant. And I'm guessing there's a lot of agency folks and consultants on the phone with us here today. And, largely we're to blame. I'm to blame because we've been the ones that have been making posts like this on our blogs, saying brands got to create engaging content. We have to create compelling content. Here's a whole bunch of ideas. And while that may be true, and that has been true in the past, no question, it still is, there's very little in the way of more specific recommendations, and in many cases more of a pragmatic kind of recommendations that get brands in a better spot for long-term success rather than this kind of episodic or more campaign feel that we sometimes see on the brand side. I hate to say it, but I blame Oreo too. Oreo, through their product of their own success, through not only the Super Bowl tweet that changed everything, but also just their kind of real-time marketing and prowess in general, kind of set the stage for other brands to mimic them. And we've seen that, in spades over and over again the last couple of years. And we've seen people try to mimic their approach and try to capitalize on real-time marketing at anything from the Oscars to the World Series to the Super Bowl to, finales, or even not even finales, season-ending finales of TV shows. So the Zyrtec example at the beginning was Scandal was a good example of that, where people are trying to kind of force themselves into conversations based on real-time marketing that really just aren't even there. So I hate to say it, but Oreo's kind of was at the forefront of that, and they're, from the brand side, they're blamed. Now, they're not the only brand that was if there's a brand side, you're not blaming Oreo necessarily, but like even the successful ones, Oreo, very successful. Belize Tourism Board, another very successful brand that had a great case study with, kind of real-time content marketing with this. If you remember this back when Breaking Bad was live and on TV, there was a mention of them sending Hank, I believe, to Belize, and in a negative connotation. Well, Belize saw that, and the folks at Olson, which is an advertising agency based up here in Minneapolis, actually, that represents them, saw that and had this kind of nice response where they flipped it and invited the cast on a trip to Belize to see for themselves what it's all about. So this campaign was saw great success. They saw over 300 million media impressions. According to Olson, they saw their positive to negative mentions go from 1-to-1 to 8-to-1. The campaign ended up winning awards. So here's another example of a brand doing great things, but then setting the stage for what we've seen with so many brands trying to mimic that. And the issue is, not every brand is going to be able to capture lightning in the bottle here, right? So as consultants and as people that are advising our brands, it's kind of our job to call them on that and say, you know what, this doesn't feel right, like the right idea right now, or this feels like we're capitalizing on something that's not there. In many cases, if that would have been the advice, we would have maybe not seen so many of these brands jumping into the real-time marketing stuff that we have lately. And then let's face it, I promised cat picks, and here's your cat pick. Some marketers are just plain lazy. So the marketing and PR profession is not unlike any other profession where there's a continuum of people, right? You have your overachievers and your very successful people. I tend to think in the PR profession and marketing profession we're high in those ranks, but we're also, we also have a number of people that can just be lazy in what they do, and I think that's part of what's to blame too. You see a lot of these posts like the Kohl's one I showed you earlier. The Kohl's is certainly not the only one that's posted about some of these holidays, like wishing people a happy Labor Day. To me, that kind of reeks of kind of just lazy marketing. Really, brands wishing people a happy Labor Day, that's kind of a reach, right? So a little bit of this is kind of laziness on our ends too. So what do we do now? I want to spend the bulk of the time obviously talking about what we do now because we know where we are. I talked a little bit about how I think we got there, but we're going to spend the bulk of the time today hopefully talking about what we do now. So this is kind of I have 6 steps here that kind of outline a process that I've personally taken with a number of clients over the last number of years. I've been an independent consultant for the last 5 years, and this kind of reflects a little bit of my approach, at least when it comes to content development. And the first step we'll usually take is conducting a comprehensive content audit. And I know that's not rocket science. I know that's not this big aha, but if more people were to do this, then we wouldn't see what we're seeing online. I just have a strong feeling of that. So while this might not seem like rocket science, I still don't think there's a ton of people doing it. So hit the pause button. Use it as a chance to catch your breath, even if it's just for a couple days even. Reset your expectations, and think about this comprehensive content audit, what that might look like. So part of that's going to involve reviewing and analyzing your existing content, obviously, across all your social channels. So look at what you're doing with your blog, look at what you're doing with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever social channels that you are involved with, where you produce content for your brand or your client. Take a look at those. What are you doing? Obviously, you also want to take a look at your data sources. So you're looking at Facebook Insights, you're looking at Google Analytics, you're looking at some of these other data sources and what those numbers look like. And I'll show you a kind of a dashboard here from a Facebook Insights dashboard from a former client of mine. And I point this out because gathering the data is obviously just the first step. It's kind of analyzing and synthesizing the data that really matters, right? So the example I'll give you here is I'll just kind of walk you through my thinking and how I looked at this. So my step when I looked at their data here was we're kind of looking at, first I want to compare apples to apples. So at Facebook now, as more brands get into Facebook advertising, you have to compare apples to apples in terms of posts that you're promoting versus posts that you're not promoting, right? So you don't want to compare a post you're promoting versus one you're not promoting because it's not going to be an even comparison, obviously. So in this case, I'm looking for posts that I know we've promoted in the past versus those we haven't. So on the right side, you can see the blue button that says Boost Posts. You can see the ones that say See Results. So let's just look at the ones that say you See Results because those are the ones I know I promoted. If I'm looking at those, I can see that a number of these have similar impression marks, you can see, and they all generated a decent amount of likes and comments. I mean, reasonably speaking, this page doesn't have a ton of likes. But one of them generated a lot more comments than the other one. That's that middle post, 170. And what's interesting about that is that that post wasn't designed to generate, but to spur comments. It wasn't an engagement-focused post, as I would call it. The top one is, if you can see that, it's the one bike accessory you own that you can't live without. That's a direct question. We're looking for engagement there, right? And that generated a fair amount of comments, 72. We weren't disappointed with that. But the middle one generated 170 comments, which was by far the most amongst those three. And that one didn't ask a question at all. It didn't have any engagement angle to it at all. But what it did was it looked at the pride factor of being associated with this particular organization, which is a nonprofit bike shop. And it was getting at the fact that all these people, thank you for donating your bike, or if you know someone that donated a bike, would really appreciate it, that kind of thing. So it was getting this pride factor. So one of the aha moments for us was we should look at posting more things that get at that pride factor of, just the sole fact of people like being associated with us. And that should come as no surprise, really, if you think about it on Facebook. People like your page because they like you, right? They're affiliated with your brand in some way, shape, or form, whether they're an advocate for you, they're a customer, they're a vendor, they're a partner, whatever. They like you in some way, shape, or form. So in this case, it was just this light bulb went off around, well, we need to just produce a little bit more content around, content that gets at that factor of people just like to support us in that kind of way. So that gives you an example of how we kind of looked at the data there. Here's an example of how we looked at the data in terms of the Google Analytics. What I was charged with as background with this client was helping them generate more revenue for their bike sales operations, so selling bikes and selling bike services. So they were a nonprofit bike shop, and this was generating sales was a revenue funnel that they used to pay for the nonprofit programming that they also provided. So they provided some of that programming through grants, of course, but sales through bike sales and bike shop sales was also a big part of that. So my job was to help raise awareness for that, basically. So it was nice to see their sales page. It shows up as number 3 on their Google Analytics here. But you can look at some of the other pages that show up in the top 14 here, and you notice a lot of them have to do with programming. So a lot of them are around Earn a Bike and some of their other programming options. So the kind of the learning for me as I looked at this was thinking about this in terms of our content mix. So yes, we have to have some posts that focus on that sales aspect and focus on what we're going to sell. But I think the conclusion was let's have a lot of content that focuses more on the programming because that's how we're going to engage people. And we can't raise awareness if we're not really getting people's attention. And the way we're going to get their attention is through the programming piece of it. And that can lead to the sales later on. So there's another example of kind of digging into the content a little bit that kind of is informing the larger content strategy. as you're reviewing and analyzing, so you're looking at your existing content, you're looking at the numbers. You also, I think, it makes sense to get anecdotal feedback from the customers and fans. So a lot of this, I think, you can just get by looking at, comments in Facebook posts, replies on Twitter, comments in Instagram posts, comments in blogs, stuff like that. That stuff can be really helpful if you dig in, and I think there's still a lot of brands out there that just don't dig into that. Not to mention, it can be great. It's great to pull that stuff out and put it in your content audit, so your manager sees it, so your boss sees it, so your client sees it, because the anecdotal feedback those are often the nuggets that really make your content come to life. It's reacting to what you posted out there. It's confirming maybe what you already thought about how your customers feel, stuff like that. You want that to come to life in a content audit, and pulling those anecdotes out is really going to help that. I think you also want to get anecdotal feedback from your customer or your employees and your leadership too. So maybe you get a little focus group of employees together and ask them what they think about how your social content is developing, and get some leadership buy-in. I mean, that's never a bad thing, right? So looking internally too when you think about your content audit is always a good thing. And then finally, take a look at 3 to 4 competitors or brands you admire. So when I do content audits for companies, this is the single piece that they always rave about, that this is like, wow, I really hadn't looked at what our competitors were doing for the last 6 to 9 months, and this is really helpful. So do an audit on them just like you would on you. So you're not going to be able to see the data and insights on the backside, obviously, but you can still, what I do is kind of take a snapshot of what they're doing across the board with their content, and then kind of put some analyzation to it, or in terms of, what do you think, or what do I think is working and what isn't, and then what does that mean in terms of opportunities for your brand or your client. Again, that piece has always been probably one of the biggest things that clients have commented on in the past for me in terms of what they find useful. In fact, I have one client where we will do this on an annual basis, every 6 to 9 months, about on a biannual basis, where we'll look back at what their competitors have been doing the last 6 to 9 months, and it's been setting a nice benchmark now, so we can see who's really progressing, who's regressing, which direction they're going, and what that means for this particular client. So after you've done all the reviewing and analyzing, you want to start identifying your content, right? So think about what content already exists that you're not already using. So there's some spots that I call kind of like forgotten content that you can explore that maybe you're not already exploring. So things like employee stories. For larger companies, the internal communications group is usually a really good spot to look for really compelling stories featuring employees and customers and all those kinds of things. Some of it, you might not be able to share all of it. I mean, some of it might be proprietary, or for whatever reason you don't want to share it externally, but there's certainly a decent amount of it that you can share and you might want to share. So that's worth looking there. I think about things like white papers, slide decks that, where other thought leaders across your organization have presented throughout the years, where they might not be publishing them on SlideShare, obviously, but they're still giving those presentations somewhere. So is there a way that you might want to repurpose or use that content differently? Then you want to think about what content does your client or your company want, right? So this is really going to include, most likely, content that sells a product or services, or sells your company in some way, whether you're a for-profit company, nonprofit, asking for donations, whatever. They're going to want something along those veins, right? That's almost a given. But then ask yourself and ask your team what content, do you know what content your customers really want from you? What are they looking for, and how can you somehow provide some of that content? Have you really thought about what that looks like? And then think about the mix, right? So the mix could be as high as, you've seen some brands that go as high as, like, maybe I would say 80-20 on the customer-focused content versus brand-focused content. Then you see some that go closer to 50-50 and even flip the other way. And everyone's a little bit different, right? I don't think there's a right or wrong ratio there. Just kind of what works best for your brand, but I think there's got to be some kind of mix, obviously, and thinking about that really proactively when you do your audit, I think is a really good idea. So once you've started and kind of gone down this content audit road, which, by the way, that's a great first step, and if you're just doing that, I would say once a year, you're going to be really surprised, I think, in how big a difference that makes in your efforts, really. And it doesn't really have to take a long time in a content audit. Even a really basic one shouldn't take you all that long. So beyond that first step, though, the next step is kind of maybe taking a closer look at your resources. So maybe it's not so much identifying resources, because that kind of implies you're starting from scratch, but re-identifying your resources. So in this case, I'm thinking about how you resource your content. So there's obviously three big options here. I put the fourth one in just because I want to have a little fun and talk about something I think is interesting here at the tail end of this. But you have your in-house options, you have agency options, obviously, and you have independent consultants or freelancers. And then you have robots, and we'll talk about robots in a minute. So I'm going to kind of go through like pros and cons of each of these at a real high level and kind of skate through this pretty quickly. But I think this kind of gives you a thinking for how a client would think or how a brand thinks about how they're going to source this content. The pros of insourcing your content, obviously, less ramp-up time, knows your brand better. There's people already on the inside there and know you pretty well. And they also have quicker access to internal subject matter experts. So as a consultant, I can tell you on the outside, that's one of my biggest challenges is I have a hard time getting in touch with people as subject matter experts because it's easy for them to ignore me, right? Whereas an internal person is going to have a much better chance of getting their attention just because of their email address in many cases. The cons of the in-house sourcing is sometimes the in-house people aren't necessarily the best resource. And what I mean by that is, sometimes you tap someone on the shoulder and say, hey, we need you to take over our content for 2015. Well, that person might not be necessarily a content marketing expert. They might be a former media relations person that's being asked to do content. And sure, they're writers, and yeah, they might know stuff, but maybe they don't have a passion for content marketing necessarily. So that's kind of what I mean by that piece of it. And then there might be existing political barriers that might be providing roadblocks. So maybe the employee that you're tapping for help really wants another job, and now you're asking them to do this one. They're not going to give up their full heart. Where if you had another person that was fully focused on it, they would. So there's some of those things that come out in the in-house side that can provide challenges. On the agency side, the pros obviously have access to many more human resources. I think about hiring, if you hire I'm a PR guy, I think about big PR firms like Fleischman and Weber and some of those. They have global networks of people that they can pull in at a moment's notice. I work with one client, and I partner with one of those big agencies, and they're pulling in resources from across the country. The team is from all over the place. So the access to human resources is much greater on the agency side, especially as you go bigger. I think agencies obviously give you a much-needed outside perspective. That's always valuable when you're on the client side, and then it provides kind of an all-in-one package. So when you think about content, one of the biggest challenges now is you got to think about text, you got to think about photo content, you got to think about graphics, you got to think about video, you got to think about short-form video, all that stuff. And agencies give you a nice, really all-in-one package, usually in that case, where they can do it all. The cons on the agency side, obviously, they're going to be a little more expensive. And I put longer dating cycle because, if you're going to engage an agency, usually it's going to involve some form of RFP process, whether it's a formal RFP or whether it's kind of seeking out agencies. Usually that process is going to take a little while, so you have to budget for that. On the solo side, the pros are, what you see is what you get. Obviously, when an independent goes in, you're largely working with that independent. They don't have a team of people behind them. For the most part, it's really that person is working with you, and you're most likely you're a big fish in a small pond for that independent, because I can tell you as an independent consultant myself, there's only so many hours in the day. I don't scale, so I can only handle so many clients at one time, and then after that, I start saying no. So the cons on the independent side are kind of the pro is the con. So on the pro, it's what you see is what you get, and on the con, it's just one person means just one person. So if my client comes to me and says, hey, Arik, you've been doing a great job in this content this year. We'd like you to take on more next year. Sometimes I'll have to say no because, A, I don't have the bandwidth, or B, I don't want that client to get really big because I don't want them to be my only client, because then if I lose that client for whatever reason, I'm out all my work. So a lot of independents will think about it that way, and I think that's a con on the independent side. Lastly, I want to talk about robots real quick, because this is, believe it or not, a viable option at some point down the road, I believe. And right now it's a viable option for some people because there's tools like Wordsmith, which will produce as many as 2,000 simple articles per second, they're saying. And believe it or not, the language the robots use is not really that, as robotic as you might think. So a couple of real-world case studies of how people or brands that are actually using this tool right now include if you play fantasy football right now, Yahoo Fantasy Football, they are using Wordsmith to generate these personalized reports that you get on a weekly basis that tell you about your fantasy football team. So if you are playing Yahoo Fantasy Football, look at your report next time and just think a robot wrote that. And, again, language isn't quite as stiff and as robotic as you might think. Apparently the AP is also using Wordsmith. I believe they were using Wordsmith to source and generate some of their financial summaries for, publicly held companies. So the reporters are obviously still writing the analysis of what's happening, but they're using Wordsmith to generate the basic summary based on some of the data they're getting on the back end. So I'm not sure robots are going to take over our lives anytime soon. I blogged about this actually this week, but I do think it's something to keep an eye on. And actually right now, from a consultant point of view, so many of us are generating reports for our clients and our companies. This Wordsmith tool actually is a pretty cool tool for that. I did the demo on it a couple weeks ago, and it can generate some pretty nice reports from Google Analytics right now. Now they're hoping to generate or pull in some of the other social platforms soon, but right now, for that, it might be something worth taking a look at. Obviously, you got to add your own 2 cents, and you got to add some analyzing to it, but it provides a nice start for now. So you've created a content audit, you've identified resources. Now it's really time to start digging in and creating that content plan of attack. So there's a couple kind of high-level concepts I want to talk about before I get into these content cornerstones. And the first is, when you're kind of getting into creating content, ask yourself what your mission is. So if you kind of center yourself around your mission when you're thinking about your content, I think it just provides a different context that will take you away from doing some of these silly things like I showed you at the beginning of the deck. I'll give Sleep Number as my example here. Sleep Number is a client of mine, and I have been for the last 5 years. And their mission is really kind of delivering personalized sleep experiences. So they produce, for those of you that don't know Sleep Number, they produce beds, and the bed is created with a technology called dual layer technology where you can adjust the bed on either side of the bed. So the point is you can have your side a little firmer, your spouse can have their side a little softer, and everyone wins. Personalized sleep experiences. So when we develop content, that's kind of the filter through things. And I think that helps center us a little bit more, and I think that could be a nice thing to just think about as you kind of develop content on a long-term basis. The kind of second high-level thing I want to bring up is this notion of going from long-form content to micro-content. So creating one big piece of content and then breaking it apart into smaller pieces of content that you can use for months on end. So the example I give here is a former client of mine called Bike Walk Move. And Bike Walk Move is a biking, walking advocacy organization that's focused on, not surprisingly, getting more people biking and walking. And my piece of this campaign was around PR and social content strategy. And one of my challenges was figuring out a way to use this bike walk report they'd created. They literally had people sitting on street corners once a year counting the number of people that go by on bikes and walking. And then they would use this report that they generated to show people that more people are biking and walking. They'd use it for advocacy efforts. They'd use it with the media. And it was great, but the problem was it was really dry content. It was all numbers. It was hard. They had some analysis there, and it was good, but it was just really dry. So my thought was, let's make this thing visual. Let's make it a little bit more fun, and let's see how we can use it in some different ways. So we created a big infographic that probably encapsulated 8 to 10 of these ideas, or these key data points, I should say. And we created this big infographic. We put it on their blog, and that became the online home base. And then we started to rip it apart, and we started to use it in micro content. So, for example, there was maybe 10 pieces of different data points on there. Like I said, we ripped each one of those data points out as a graphic and used those as individual Facebook posts. And then we promoted those Facebook posts to our key audiences here in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And those posts were some of our most successful posts throughout that campaign. We also used pieces of that infographic as outdoor advertising. We used it on posters at events. We used them, I believe, in print advertising as well. So we used it in so many different ways over the course of the next 6, 7, 8 months after we developed the infographic. I'd like to say in this campaign we spent about $5,000, I think, creating this infographic and coordinating it. And it was probably the best $5,000 we invested in that campaign. And it was a high dollar value campaign. And just that little $5,000 went a whole heck of a long way because we had this approach where it was like, here's this big form of content, big piece of content that's sitting on our blog, and then we're going to repurpose it and break it apart into smaller pieces that we're going to use throughout the campaign. So I mention this because we're all facing, tighter budgets. We're all having to do more with less. Here's the strategy that helps you do more with less and does it in a pretty pragmatic kind of way. So those are kind of the overarching themes. I also want to go over some kind of what I call, I think Natalia alluded to this at the beginning, these content cornerstones that I think can guide some of your content development as you go forward. So, number one, instead of mimicking what other brands are doing, stay true to your brand voice, your mission, and your values. So I use Sleep Number again as the example here, in that they tend to not get too cute with their content on social channels. They usually try to stay pretty true to who they are, and that is, like I said, the mission is personalizing sleep experiences. The brand voice is pretty conservative by their values. I mean, what they value is sleep. They stick pretty close to all that stuff in what they talk about online. And they stay pretty true to who they are. They don't try to be someone they're not, for the most part. Number two, instead of kind of playing off popular social memes, so we've seen a ton of those. I mean, just last week we saw Pointergate, right? If you live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, you know all about that. That kind of exploded nationally, too. Create content your customers will just find useful or entertaining. So the example I give here, amongst others, is Intelligentsia Coffee. For those of you that are coffee drinkers who haven't tried this coffee before, it's outstanding coffee. What they do a great job of here is they provide these brew guides, right? So there's so many different ways to brew coffee now, right? All these geeky ways. I have a Chemex here at home that I use religiously. And one of the ways I learned to use the Chemex, actually, was through their brew guide here. So here's an excellent way. They know people are drinking their coffee, and they know they're drinking it in many different ways because it's the higher end of coffee. So why not provide these guides to help them figure out how to brew the coffee so it tastes the best it could taste? So it's just a simple but brilliant execution of content marketing by Intelligentsia here. On the entertaining side of things, I will show you this video. I'm not going to show you the video. You can watch this on your own. I'm not going to take up too much time here, but if you do have the time, watch this video by IKEA out of Malaysia and Singapore. This is a video where they kind of poke fun at the way in which Apple presents products to market while showcasing their idea book, which is, as if you've been to any IKEA store, you know is pretty a dominant way they showcase their products and services. This video has 12 million views per day, to date and 9,000 comments, and it's just a really well-done video. IKEA really has the content marketing thing nailed down. They do a great job in many ways outside of this video, but I thought the video was just a really good way of entertaining customers while hammering home a nice product that they developed, which is the idea book. So it's hard to replicate this, I think. It's hard to entertain and make it be funny online if you're a brand, but if you're going to do it, I thought this was a really nice example of a brand that gets it and does it well. Number three, instead of promoting some of the more meaningless holidays that we've seen, so I'll pick on a competitor, Sleep Number, since I can do that, called Mattress Firm promotes had a post promoting Better Breakfast Month a couple months ago, and I thought that was kind of funny. Why not amplify your customers' best content instead? So the example I give here is Nature Valley, where they're amplifying a customer or a fan who is camping out here outside looks like the Rockies. And, so if General Mills and Nature Valley were going to try to generate some of this visual content on their own, they'd have to spend thousands of dollars sending photographers out to some of these locales to get this great outdoor content that Nature Valley is looking for. Instead, they just regularly re-Instagram things on Instagram around fans that are doing some of the things that their fans do, and that is enjoy the great outdoors. So it's a great example by Nature Valley of really just promoting and amplifying their customers' content. Phonak is another organization that does this really well. Phonak is a hearing aid manufacturer. They're a competitor of a client of mine. And again, they're re-Instagramming all these pictures of people wearing their hearing aids. And you might think that's a big deal, But the big deal here is that for hearing aid manufacturers, they don't have a direct line of sight to their customers usually. hearing aid manufacturers typically are selling those, or selling their products to, they're working through audiologists or just what they call dispensers to get to the patient. So the audiologist or the dispenser owns the relationship with the patient. Therefore, the hearing aid manufacturer really rarely sees their product unless it's on Instagram where fans are posting them. So smart of Phonak to be out there kind of re-Instagramming photos that they wouldn't normally have access to. Number 4, instead of trying to become the next Oreo, as we talked about before, focus on content that builds that pride factor. So I showed you the example before. Here is again of the bike shop that was inspiring pride. This post, as I showed you before, had all the decent engagement here. But specifically on Facebook, since that's an audience that's paying attention to you and likes you anyways and is pretty committed, think about what inspires them in terms of that pride factor. Why are they excited and happy to be involved with your organization, and then generate content that kind of gets at that a little bit more. Number 5, instead of promoting your products and services a little bit too much and getting, tipping the scale a little bit on that side, think about how you can inspire your customers through powerful images and in many cases video. So again, this is another video I'm not going to play, but if you have the time, I highly suggest you take a peek at it. It's only a couple minutes long, a minute and a half if that. But it's a video from Gatorade. And as many of you baseball fans know, Derek Jeter retired this past year. And when he retired, obviously it's a big deal. And so Gatorade wanted to celebrate that a little bit, so they produced this video. And it's a really good video, interesting video, and powerful video from the standpoint that I'll walk you through a little bit. Jeter's going to the ballpark. He stops his truck. He's got a driver, of course. He stops his truck a couple of blocks from Yankee Stadium. He gets out and starts walking. And when he's walking, of course, people are approaching him. He interacts with this lady, and they're talking about cell phones, and he's talking about how he doesn't know how to work a smartphone. And he stops into a bar, and the bar manager says, how come you never came in before? And he says, because you didn't ask me. And he's talking to kids, and they got the widest grin on their face. And it's just really, really well done and really, really emotional. I mean, if you're a baseball fan and you watch that video, and I'm a Twins fan. I live in Minneapolis. I'm a diehard Twins fan. There's no one on earth I hate more than the Yankees. So, and every time I watch this video, I get chills. So it's working, right? It's inspiring emotion. It's inspiring me to feel better about, I'm not going to feel better about Derek Jeter, but I feel better, you can feel better about the brand that's producing it. Now, Gatorade was smart, right? The whole video, you don't see anything regarding Gatorade except for the very tail end of the video, and all you see is the Gatorade logo. So you're seeing more of this kind of branded content come through where it's more about storytelling. It's more about, an emotional connection with their customers, and it's very little about the brand. It's almost like it's sponsored content, really, at the end of the day. But really good video if you have a chance to watch this one and take a look at it. Number 6, don't talk too much about events that only you care about as a brand. Instead, try to tell rich, meaningful stories about the people who make up your company. So in this case, I think about I'll talk about Microsoft in a minute, but when I think about companies or industries that talk a lot about the only events they care about. I spent a lot of time in the healthcare field in a former life, and one of the hospitals I spent time at was guilty of this, I thought, in that we spent a lot of time talking about events that only we cared about, instead of talking about the people that made up our company, which were all these incredible physicians and nurses and care practitioners who were the face of our organization. And they were wonderful people that helped people on a daily basis, and we never really got around to telling their story that well externally. But Microsoft has figured this out. So Microsoft Stories is, bar none, one of the best content websites by brand online right now, in my opinion. I blogged about this in the past, but they really have this nailed down, at least right now, in the way they are kind of approaching storytelling from a brand perspective. So the example I give here is the guy on the left there, Kevin White. He is a program manager with Bing Data Analytics, and you see him drinking a glass of wine here, and you're thinking, what does that do with Microsoft? Well, turns out he's a winemaker, and he has a winery, and he uses big data to refine his wine process. So that links you into the Microsoft story, and it's just a wonderful story, and they do that throughout the site. And Microsoft is really doing a great job of telling these rich, meaningful stories about their people as a way to kind of project some of their goals. In this case, it might be an awareness play, it might be a recruiting play. Who knows? We're not with Microsoft, but I thought they really did a nice job here. Number 7, resist the urge to get too cute, but instead be a resource and build brand affinity and trust. So Hilton Suggests is a Twitter account. Some of you may have seen that the whole MO is just to help people have a better travel experience. So largely, they're not suggesting Hilton hotels. Once in a while they are, but largely they're just trying to help people find a better restaurant, find a better route, ideas on vacations. They're just trying to help. And they're hoping that affinity and brand trust over the years helps people feel better and think better of Hilton, and then they'll stay at their hotels. So think about how you can be a resource and to your customers in some way that doesn't involve just always selling a product all the time. And then finally, number 8, instead of focusing on creating content, focus on creating headlines. Really focus significant effort on creating headlines. The example I'll give you here is that I used to be, in a former life, I used to work on the advertising agency side. And I was a copywriter. And my creative director would ask me for, hey, I need 50 headlines on my desk by tomorrow for that client. So I'd crank out 50 headlines. And then he'd look at them and he'd say, these suck. I need 50 more by tomorrow. So I'd crank out 100 headlines in the course of a day and a half. And I think about all the content we put online now, and I think about how much time do we really invest in headlines? I mean, how much do we really invest? How many people write more than one headline even for a post? So the next time you think about writing like a Facebook headline or a blog post headline, any kind of headline, think about writing even just start with 3 to 5. Start small. You don't have to go to 100 headlines, obviously, but write more than one, and that'll help you get to a better spot, I feel like, with your headlines, which makes so much difference now in terms of social content. Most people are just reading headlines alone, but if you want any chance of anyone clicking through your content, you really need to start investing more time on headlines. So I use Dig as the example here of one site that kind of aggregates a lot of content that has really solid headlines you can learn from, but you could look at things like HuffPo and the New York Post, obviously very funny and catching headlines there. Just think about how you could write headlines differently and crank out more as a way to get to better headlines. So that's a little bit about content cornerstones. You also want to think about your sources and what content you can develop with the help of others and what content you can develop on your own. So if you're thinking about your sources, you have your organizational connectors, you have your customers, you have your frontline employees, you have your customer service agents. These are the people you're going to lean on internally to get content. But notice how far down the list I have executives here, and that's not by accident. A lot of people, the PR brain in me tells me that executives should be toward the top of this list, but when it comes to content development, executives usually fall towards the bottom because A, they don't have any time in the day, and B, they're not always the most in touch people with the front lines of what's going on. So I would really actually suggest, yes, executives need to be part of the content mix in some way, but probably not a heavy way. You really want to probably connect more with the frontline people to get story ideas and content for the most part. And then think about, what content you can create on your own. So some of these examples give you a feel for, obviously, some of the ideas you can do on your own. And then what does the mix look like between the two, right? So you can't rely on your client or your company for all your content. Otherwise, you're going to get hung up because they have day jobs, they have lives, they have other things they're responsible for. You might have a hard time getting their attention, right? If you can supplement that with some of these posts here where you can create some of this stuff on your own with minimal help from a subject matter expert, then you can get a more steady drumbeat of content instead of getting hung up in the approval process for, days and weeks on end. So one brand that's really good at this is Buffer. So Buffer is a social app I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, but they also have a fantastic blog. And you can see here just the headlines they write. They're doing a lot of the things we were just talking about, right? How-to posts, list posts, everything guide to Twitter cards. So sure, they talk about Buffer once in a while. They talk about the tool. They talk about the upgrades they're making. But many times they're talking about stuff that's just important to their readers. And they know that the customers want this stuff, and they're using that as a way to engage and create awareness amongst a bigger audience. And in large part, that bigger audience is people like us. So once you've created a content plan of attack, the next step is kind of thinking about distribution of content, right? So you have, your basic distribution channels like social. Obviously, social channels, email is another big distribution channel that you want to think about, obviously. But what I want to focus on in this section really is how you might think about distribution in terms of repurposing your content. Specifically right now, how you're repurposing that content in terms of LinkedIn publishing. So we're seeing an interesting trend here with LinkedIn publishing. This is the tool that was once only available to LinkedIn influencers like Mark Cuban and Richard Branson, but now has become available to mostly everyone. And now we're seeing a lot of executives actually use their personal accounts to distribute content in different ways. So for example, here's something from Jeff Jones, the CMO of Target earlier this year. So if you heard, Target was in a bit of a financial crisis earlier this year. they were also in a bit of a culture dilemma. They had, if you remember, an anonymous employee, believe it or not, had written an article to, I believe it was Gawker at the time, about taking shots at the target culture, saying it was, in the toilets, people are, morale's at all-time low, blah, blah, blah. And it kind of created this media whirlwind, and Target needed to respond. Target, the culture is a big deal for them. They recruit a lot. They need a lot of employees, seasonal employees, whatnot. Recruiting is a big deal. They need to respond. And your Target, you can respond in any number of different ways. Their bullseye blog, mainstream media, whatnot. They chose to respond via Jeff Jones' personal LinkedIn account. In this post right here, The Truth Hurts, where he goes on and talks about how the culture was kind of broken at the time, but here's what we're doing to fix it. And a real honest kind of approach about what's happening at Target and what the future lies for them. So I thought that was a really interesting thing, and it kind of sparked a little trend. Now you see more CEOs like Gary Kelly from Southwest Airlines. Here he's repurposing some content of behind the making of Southwest's new look, right? That was something they were talking about a lot a couple months ago. And this was just another way for them to talk about that differently. Or Humana's CEO, Bruce Bussard, and how he's talking about Google Glass here, what really needs to be discussed. So here's another CEO of a healthcare company talking about trends in his industry and using his personal LinkedIn account as a way to kind of distribute or repurpose content that they may have been using in different channels. So not saying every CEO is going to run out there and do this now, but think about how you could use tools like LinkedIn Publishing a little bit differently from personal profiles now to kind of repurpose content and use it as a distribution platform. The other thing you want to keep in mind with when you're thinking about distribution of content is this, really. This graphic right here sums it up, and that is you've got to really keep in fact that it's increasingly a mobile-first world. All these platforms, all the social platforms are going towards a mobile-first environment. Even LinkedIn is driving that way. So think about how your content is consumed online, what it looks like, what the experience is like, and how that plays out for your customers. I mean, think about even testing it yourself. That can go a long ways towards shaping your strategy and what you do on the front end. So one organization that I think that really does the distribution thing well is Contently. Contently is a content marketing organization itself, so no surprise they should get this really well. But this is an example of their email, their daily email that I get that I love. And this is it right here. 3 stories every day. And what's brilliant about it is look at how easy it is to consume. This is how it shows up on my phone, right? So it's headline, image, teaser. I click on this, I get to the website, it's mobily optimized, it's easy to read, it's easy to click on, piece of cake. I'm looking at my phone every day. And what's brilliant about this as well, in terms of not only they get the mobile experience nailed, but they repurpose content wonderfully. So like the lead story in this is always a timely story at the top, but the bottom 2 are always a mix of evergreen content that they just repurpose over and over again, and stories that are supposed to be lead generators. So they always include like an offer at the end, like an ebook or a white paper or whatnot. So all they're doing there is repurposing stories like evergreen stories, lead stories from the bottom to get at bottom line growth, right? They want people to hire them, obviously, and they need to get them further down the funnel. So I think Contently is a great example of an organization that really gets the distribution side of this. So after you figure out a distribution plan, you got to figure out an amplification plan, right? Because now distribution's not enough. We know that the paid section is really it really should be integrated here. So think about what that looks like in terms of social advertising, sponsored content, which I think you're going to see blow up in the next year, and syndication. So I'll give you a couple quick examples here. I'm trying to wrap up quickly. So I have enough time for questions. But social advertising. So here's my Sleep Number folks again with their amplification on Facebook. Social advertising is a big piece of what we do there. We can micro-target. We pay attention to how the posts line up with what we're doing with advertising. I mean, that's just a huge – Facebook advertising is a great platform for micro-targeting, and we take advantage of that to the hilt. On the sponsored content side, here's an example from another client of mine named UCare, which is a health insurance company up here in Minnesota. They started a blog. I helped them start a blog a couple of years ago, and as a way to get that blog off the ground, one of our strategies to get more attention for that blog was use sponsored content to drive traffic. So we approached the folks at Bring Me the News and used sponsored content to hopefully drive traffic to the blog, and this has worked wonderfully so far. 60% of their blog traffic is coming from referrals. and third-party sites, and 44% of those are coming from this Bring Your News site. So that model has worked well for that particular client. And then finally, syndicated content. Like this example with Bike, Walk, Move, what we did with them is we had this great blog. We were producing all this content for it, regular drumbeat of content, but we realized that it wasn't doing enough work for us. It was getting a nice amount of clicks and reads through traffic we were driving from Facebook and organic traffic, search traffic, but it wasn't getting a ton. So we thought, why not repurpose it in a media outlet like the Southwest Journal, which was right in our sweet spot in terms of audience. So we pitched the Southwest Journal on, what if we gave you a byline post every other week that focused on biking and walking in your neighborhood. Say it's a neighborhood paper in Southwest Minneapolis. There's a lot of people that bike and walk around there. And so it made sense. They jumped on it. We would repurpose the blog posts into byline articles, and everyone was happy. We got additional traffic and eyeballs in the area that we really cared about. Southwest Journal got great content. It was a great pair and mix. So one company that gets this really well is Intel. Intel has sponsored content on this publication called The Verge. They do this 10-part video series featuring people working in different industries with technology, and just really feels like the right fit. I'm not an employee of Intel, so I don't know what they're thinking, but it feels like the right fit in terms of the publication they chose, which is The Verge, which is this fringy publication with tech implications. And then they chose, video as their storytelling tool, which also makes sense because a lot of people are consuming, more video these days. They're doing it mobilely, which works well on your phone. I mean, I just like the mix they have going on there. And in general, just as a brand, has really had good success with their storytelling and through sponsored content. So after all that, obviously, you want to, after we've determined, we've done the audit, we've identified resources, we've figured out the content plan, we've distributed the content, we've amplified it, and now, obviously, we need to measure. So you want to think about, obviously, things like Google Analytics here and social signals. Those are not anything new, and I'm sure everyone's looking at those things. But then you also want to think about things like engage time and attention time, which are becoming increasingly popular in the publishing world, and you're seeing a lot of these publishers measuring this as a key metric now. Or things like visitor loyalty, like how many times is a particular person coming back to your blog or your site over and over again. And that shows, you want to measure compelling content. That's a great way to do it because it shows people are coming back and back over and over again. And then don't forget about your email metrics either. It's, looking at click-through rates, open rates, which articles people are clicking on from an e-newsletter point of view can be just as helpful as the Google Analytics on the back end. So make sure you're looking at that stuff as well. So you have plenty of measurement options here to look at. So I think that does it for me today. I blew through a lot of content there, so I imagine people have questions, and I'm going to leave at least a few minutes for questions. So I'll turn it over to the decision folks to kind of vet responses now.
Yeah, Arik, thank you. That was a great presentation. Before we do pop into the questions, we're going to launch a quick survey that we have right on your screen there. Your feedback is really valuable to us, and we use that to help determine not only topics for future webinars, but also how we can improve them going forward. So we'd love it if you take just a second to fill it out while we're still listening to the Q&A part. So a lot of questions today. If anybody, again, has more questions, please feel free to put them in through the Q&A panel. First question is, if a company is on several social media platforms, is it okay to post the same content across all of those platforms, or should they really be different and targeted to that individual audience?
Good question. I think that's a pretty common question that a lot of people have had over the years. And I think it kind of depends on a number of different factors. But, the first thing that occurs to me is, do you really need to be active on all those different social networks? So if you're talking about multiple different networks, the first question that occurs to me is, well, are you sure you need to be on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, all those different platforms? But I think repurposing content is okay. I think you run into issues when it becomes obvious, but it doesn't always have to be a bad thing, I don't think. And I think sometimes it doesn't take a lot of effort either to just customize it just a little bit, right? So even going from Facebook to Instagram. So if you post something on Instagram, there's obviously an easy way to repurpose it to other networks. You can do that very easily, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing all the time. Especially with the proliferation of hashtags to different networks now, it's some of the things that were awkward before are not so awkward now.
A number of questions about sort of the SEO impact of some of the things you talked about. For example, how does repurposing a blog article or syndicating content not end up hurting you due to duplicate content questions from Google and other search engines?
Good question. I preface this by saying I do not profess to be an SEO expert, so I would not take what I say as gospel when it comes to SEO advice. But what I would say in terms of repurposing content in a way that where Google won't, or some of the search engines won't see it as duplicative content, maybe it's just a matter of kind of, when I say repurpose, I mean really repurpose. Don't just slap it up and repurpose it, straight repurpose. So I think back to my bike, walk, move example that I showed you in the presentation. When we repurposed that content for a different audience, we really did repurpose it. We wrote a different headline for it. It was the same content. It was just a little bit different. So it had a different headline. The content itself was maybe a little bit tweaked to a more specific audience. And that didn't take that long. It wasn't like that process was all that time consuming. It was maybe 15 minutes to a half an hour of work to repurpose it a little bit and use it in a different way. So I don't think the repurposing always has to be that much work, really, when you think about it. But the straight SEO implications, I would be remiss if I kind of commented on that, because I know enough to be dangerous in the SEO world, but I'm not sure I should be commenting on that kind of thing that has serious SEO implications.
Okay. And there's been a lot of talk about Facebook recently with their sort of algorithm changes that's really sort of hitting companies hard in terms of the organic traction that they used to get out of Facebook. What's your take on the value of Facebook today?
I think obviously Facebook has taken a lot of hits, and a lot of people have complained about that in the last year. And I'm going to show you the graphic in the presentation. And the way I try to, when I work with clients and consult clients, I try to get them to think about Facebook now really as an advertising platform, because that's really kind of what it is. And not to think about it negatively as an advertising platform. Think about Facebook as the most wonderful advertising tool on the planet, because especially if you're interested in targeting a hyper small audience. So I think back to, again, the bike, walk, move example that I used in there. That client, we were focused on neighborhoods in the Minneapolis area. I mean, neighborhoods, actual like subsets of zip codes almost. Facebook advertising was perfect for that, because I could pick out specific zip codes that I wanted to target, and I could target demos within those zip codes. No other advertising platform gives me that ability, really. Facebook was really the only one. So, and not to mention, it was very cost effective. So this was a client that didn't have a huge advertising budget. It wasn't like we had millions of dollars sitting around, even tens of thousands of dollars. So I had to make a little bit go a long way. And in that way, Facebook gave me the best of both worlds. It gave me a very affordable advertising option, and it gave me an advertising option that I could hyper-target to a very specific audience. So I would really encourage people to just, you've got to shift your thinking about Facebook now, I think. It's an advertising platform. That's what it is. But it's a great advertising platform. It's not just, it's like, oh, Facebook's, out to get me again. It's like, just twist your thinking a little bit, I think.
Arik, thanks. This has been great. Unfortunately, it looks like we're already at the top of the hour. Thanks, everybody, for attending today. You can find an archive of our past webinars on our website. That's vocus.com. And we've also got some really great research and slides from past webinars that you can find on SlideShare. That's slideshare.com/vocus. And, of course, you can always find us on Facebook and Twitter. As a reminder, we are Vocus. We're a Cision company, a leading provider of cloud-based public relations and marketing software, and parent company to online services PR Web, Help a Reporter Out, at Contact, Visible Technologies, and Gorkana Group. Arik, thanks again for joining us today. This was fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.